I'm going to tell you a secret, and then you can leave. You are making breakfast with the guy you just met, and he casually drops a massive bomb. My family controls enterprises outside the normal boundaries of law. He is a literal crime lord giving her a free pass to escape. Most people would grab their purse and sprint out the door. But Ruby, she just asked if he wanted toast.
Welcome back to the Midnight Hour. You and I are about to watch a quiet tragedy unfold in the freezing fog of the city. Picture Ruby Hayes standing under the dim streetlights. She's been drowning in absolute isolation for 6 heavy months, so starved for human warmth that her survival instincts have completely flatlined. Her friend promised a safe harbor tonight. A gentle guy named Julian with bright blue eyes. But crushing loneliness plays cruel tricks, pushing you toward the edge, just hoping someone will catch you. She steps into the night dreaming of tender romance, entirely blind to the steel trap waiting ahead. The shadows are practically breathing, ready to strike. Here's a brutal truth we all have to learn. When you search for your salvation in the hands of a stranger, you're usually just giving them the power to orchestrate your absolute destruction. The heavy neon glare of the Crimson Lounge bleeds onto the sidewalk, where the wind is just tearing right through Ruby. She stands shivering in a thin dress, sacrificing her own warmth for a scrap of validation from a world that doesn't even know her name. Honestly, we've probably all been there, chasing approval until we're completely numb. Her glasses are fogged thick with the cold, physically blinding her to the massive warning signs looming at the door. The velvet rope and harsh dress code are just the first psychological barriers designed to strip away whatever tiny bit of confidence she has left. You can see her shoulders shaking in the dark, her natural defenses crumbling to ash. She's so terrifyingly exposed. The lesson to tonight's simple, but it hurts. The moment you abandon your own boundaries to impress the wrong people, you're leaving your softer parts completely undefended against the crush. Look closely at her trembling hands. Her knuckles are bone white, gripping a faded vintage purse like a life raft in open water. She scans the room heavy with smoke, hunting for 2 anchors, a dark suit, and a worn copy of her favorite Russian novel. And then she sees him, a massive figure at the bar, holding exactly what she is looking for. In that split second, her lonely heart explodes with a tragic, fabricated hope. It breaks you to watch, because when you are truly starved down for a lifeline, you will paint the face of a savior onto your worst possible enemy. She forces her dream onto this terrifying silhouette, willfully ignoring the pitch-black hair and the danger radiating from the shadows. The steel jaws of the trap close right there. It's a haunting life lesson. Projecting your deepest desires onto a harsh reality is the quickest way to walk straight into your own ruin. This is where the quiet desperation turns into sheer panic. Trying to cover up her overwhelming fear, Ruby decides to play the brave protagonist. But wearing a mask of fake courage never really shields you from the monsters. Instead of a careful approach, she acts completely out of character. She marches up to this imposing stranger, grabs the back of his chair, and physically turns him around, making the first contact. It's one of those agonizing moments where you want to reach through the screen and pull her back. She believes she's stepping into a sweeping romance, completely blind to the nightmare she just woke up. With one impulsive gesture, she has willingly offered herself to a highly lethal predator. The reality check here hits hard. Hiding your deepest insecurities behind a sudden burst of fake confidence will usually drag you into a devastating battle you can't possibly survive. The very instant her fingers graze his coat, the club noise fades to dead silence. All you hear is the frantic drum of her heartbeat. The man doesn't flinch. A true apex predator doesn't retreat when cornered. They just draw you into the jaws. Without a second of hesitation, he flips the power dynamic. His massive hands lock onto her, dragging her effortlessly into his dark, suffocating orbit. It's the effortless, terrifying reflex of a man who dominates every single room he enters. In a flash, Ruby's romantic daydream shatters into cold, paralyzing panic. The scent of dark liquor hits her, mixed with a grip that feels like solid iron. When her eyes finally adjust to his face, the absolute horror of her mistake lands like a physical blow. The life lesson is plain and unforgiving. Letting blind impulse drive you in dangerous places will always leave you at the complete mercy of someone who plays for keeps. Stick with me here, because you and I need to look closely at what happens next. It's that terrible, familiar split second where absolute fear bleeds into fatal attraction. Ruby is completely paralyzed, staring down into the sharp, aggressive lines of his face. The man radiates a quiet, lethal energy that suffocates the air around him. It brings up a painful life lesson. The forces most capable of tearing your world apart usually arrive wearing a beautiful, captivating disguise. When her panic finally surfaces and she stammers out a weak apology, trying to pull away, his heavy hand stays anchored to her waist. He denies her the basic human right to leave. His voice rolls out in a dark, commanding register that anchors her to the floor. It's a terrifying reminder that dangerous people don't accept your apologies. They weaponize your mistakes to lock you firmly in their grasp. This is the exact moment her psychological dismantling begins. While she squirms, trying to slip away, his iron grip simply tightens. Then he casually drops a devastating truth, telling her that the real date arrived early, didn't see her, and instantly left with someone else. It's a massive, crushing blow to her fragile ego, which is precisely the terrain a manipulator loves to control. He offers no comfort, only a dark, quiet chuckle as he watches her heart sink. He's feasting on her sudden misery, slowly tearing down her self-worth, while his thumb rhythmically traces her hip. Don't mistake that touch for gentleness. It's a calculated test to see if she'll submit to the pressure. The life lesson here is heavy but vital. The people who quietly enjoy breaking down your confidence are the exact same ones preparing to use you as a pawn in their own destructive games. Let's break this terrible moment down, because his psychological warfare is flawless. He smoothly rewrites the narrative, praising her clumsy, embarrassing mistake as an act of bravery. Her intuition is screaming for her to run, but the heavy weight of shame completely paralyzes her legs. When embarrassment makes you freeze, you're handing your power directly to the person hurting you. She asks him to let go, but her voice is thin and broken. Then he leans in and whispers the ultimate trap, claiming he's only holding her because she hasn't explicitly commanded him to stop. He shifts the blame for his aggression entirely onto her shoulders. When he finally speaks his name, Dmitry Vulov, it rings out like a dark king claiming his territory. The life lesson is terrifyingly clear tonight. If you can't find the strength to fiercely defend your boundaries, the monsters of this world will gladly consume them. The tension tightens as the grooming phase truly begins. Dmitry tastes her name on his tongue, dragging out the syllables like he just claimed a fragile new prize. He slips seamlessly into an interrogation, gently peeling back her layers to extract every vulnerable detail. When she confesses she works as an editor, his eyes drop to the Russian novel on the bar. Without missing a beat, he mirrors her passions, weaving this intoxicating, deeply toxic illusion that they're kindred spirits. Shared interests can be beautiful, but in the hands of a predator, they're just bait. He masterfully reframes her horrible mistake as destiny, confusing her starved heart into viewing him as a twisted guardian angel. Here's the chilling life lesson for us to remember. An intensely fast, mirroring connection is rarely soulmate chemistry. It's usually just a master manipulator mapping out exactly how to break you. Notice how the thick shadows seem to cage them the moment his hands finally release her. But freedom is an illusion. He simply taps the empty bar stool beside him, a silent command demanding total submission. When Ruby attempts to find her courage, quietly pointing out that his physical grip was uncalled for, he traps her again. He casually insists that her initial clumsy touch makes them equally guilty. It's terrifying how sharing a fabricated guilt can bind you to a dark soul faster than actual love ever could. As she wavers, his tone drops into a smooth, predatory growl that sounds like an invitation but carries the weight of a severe threat. Her will breaks, and she sinks into the chair, completely dizzy from his psychological poison. The life lesson is profoundly brutal here. The moment you accept responsibility for a line they crossed, you hand over the deed to your own life. Now, the atmosphere shifts into a high-stakes game of overwhelming attention. Dimitri pours on the charm, inflating her starved ego with relentless calculated praise. But beneath that smooth exterior, he's a locked vault of violent secrets. Soaking in that kind of validation feels like a warm fire when you're freezing, but a man who offers only reflections is feeding you poison. He elegantly sidesteps every real question, offering only hollow breadcrumbs about old books and a mysterious brother. As the liquor settles in her veins, the terrifying reality finally pierces her haze. She's spent hours bleeding her heart out, and he remains a completely impenetrable phantom. We have to take this life lesson to heart. Grand, sweeping flattery is almost never about making you feel seen. It's a blinding smokescreen deployed by dangerous people to hide the monstrous red flags lurking right behind them. 3 a.m, and the air between them is thick with a danger she refuses to name. Ruby is drowning, grasping for any shred of control, so she nervously laughs. She makes a clumsy joke, teasing that with his heavy secrets, he must be a mob boss. It breaks your heart to witness. Dimitri does not flinch. He just lets out a deep, rattling laugh, swapping his cold menace for a practiced, boyish grin. He feeds her some tired lie about working in imports. But there is a microsecond of hesitation before he speaks, a deliberate slip of the mask. He wants her to see the beast lurking underneath, silently daring her to run. Listen to me on this one. When the dark shows you its teeth, do not stick around to count them. Believe the warning the very first time. You and I are going to sit back and watch the exact moment the steel jaws of his trap lock into place. Ruby takes in the staggering wealth, the suffocating power, and the effortless way he commands the room. Then she makes the most tragic mistake a lonely heart can make. She looks at this hardened criminal and projects her own profound isolation onto his shoulders. We all do this, do we not? We try to fix the broken pieces in toxic people, desperately hoping it will somehow glue our own shattered souls back together. She truly believes she has uncovered a soft heart under all that frost. What she fails to understand is that a predator does not view isolation as a painful wound. To him, it is just a sharpened blade. This quiet tension is not a love story. It is a calculated strike. Notice the subtle tightening of his jaw. Dimitri delivers an absolute masterclass in playing the tortured soul. He lets the shadows swallow his face, murmuring a quiet, dangerous warning about the kind of man he truly is. But when Ruby stubbornly pushes back, he steps into the light and hands over his darkest confessions. It is a bitter pill to swallow, but people always want to believe they are the one magical exception to a walking disaster. By openly confessing that he is a monster, he brilliantly manipulates her into feeling like his sole savior. His fingers gently trace the line of her jaw, a tender touch masking a suffocating obsession. He tells her they are leaving for his place, and the night simply swallows them whole. That was no invitation to romance. It was the heavy slam of a cage. The silence is deafening, broken only by the frantic drumming of Ruby's own heartbeat. Dmitri lets his words sink in, dropping them like cinder blocks into black water. Her nervous system is screaming at her. Every instinct she possesses knows she is standing inches from a killer. Her breathing turns shallow and rapid, yet Dmitri leaves the door wide open. He casually asks what she wants to do next, shifting the entire crushing weight of the choice into her trembling hands. She has one clear shot to walk out and save herself. Instead, she leans closer and asks for another kiss. It is a painful reminder that you should never mistake a dangerous man's polite warning for a safe harbor. His lips claim hers in the shadows, a coldly calculated maneuver designed to sever her final ties to logic. The atmosphere shifts violently from moody city neon to the blinding white of his cavernous penthouse the next morning. The way he held her was not the tender embrace of a lover. It was the iron grip of a kingpin claiming his territory. Her body trembles with raw survival instinct, but her desperate mind tries to paint it as romance just to endure the fear. That is how the human brain survives when all the exits disappear. She opens her eyes to towering ceilings and a vast, empty bed, an architecture designed to make her feel isolated from the world. Remember this heavy truth as you walk your own path. Sometimes the things that look like pure luxury and protection are just beautifully gilded cages. She is not a partner here. She is a stolen prize. This suffocating morning silence is where the immense pressure finally cracks her resolve. Ruby turns her head by fractions of an inch, the simple rustle of the expensive sheets sounding like thunder in the void. She is desperately searching for a normal man buried. Beneath the creeping menace, her intuition begs her to flee. Bathed in the soft daylight, Dmitri actually looks peaceful. The killer is resting. It is a fatal flaw in the human condition. We look down at a sleeping demon and feel the urge to soothe it rather than sprinting for the nearest exit. She studies the hard muscle of his chest, a frame built for delivering violence. Trying to reconcile it with the brooding stranger from the bar, then her eyes drift to his ink. In the dark, it was just art. In the daylight, it is a map of pure brutality. Harsh sunlight pours over his broad shoulders, casting deep, jagged shadows across his tattooed skin. The camera lingers on the massive Orthodox crosses, the sharp Cyrillic letters, and the black stars stamped into his flesh. These are not weekend mistakes made in a parlor. They are the blood-stained badges of a ruthless underworld king. In that freezing moment, Ruby's internal alarms finally start screaming. She needs to vanish and pretend this nightmare never happened. It brings us back to one of the most fundamental rules of living. When your primal survival instincts beg you to run, you drop everything and flee. She holds her breath, shifting her weight to slip away. But the absolute second she moves, his massive arm clamps down on her waist like a vice. His eyes remain closed. The cage is awake. Notice how the tight framing of this shot captures the collapse of her mental defenses. Ruby begins to stammer out fragile excuses about being late for a shift, Frantically clinging to the remnants of her ordinary life, Dmitri completely ignores the desperate rambling. Instead, he focuses entirely on the violent hammering of her heart against her ribs. He flattens his heavy palm over it, drinking in the rhythm of her pure panic. This is no romantic gesture. He is calibrating the depth of his terrifying power over her. We burn so much of our own spirit, trying to negotiate with darkness that only understands total submission. When she weakly mutters that she never does random hookups, his voice drops to a lethal whisper. He pins her down and promises her this is not casual, extinguishing her final hope. Time begins to warp and dissolve inside the blinding white walls of the bedroom, trapping them in a vacuum long after the morning has passed. This suffocating isolation is a brilliant way to show how the outside world has ceased to exist for her. The room is stark and chilling, save for towering shelves crammed with battered books in a dozen different languages. Ruby forces a nervous laugh, confessing she thought his reading teen at the bar was just a prop to charm women. A cold, arrogant smirk tugs at his lips, never quite reaching his hollow eyes, as he reminds her he has no need for cheap tricks. It is a bitter lesson. When sheer terror sets in, we cling to the most mundane details to make a monster seem human. By romanticizing his books, she is just painting the iron bars of her beautiful new cell. Stick with me for a second, because we are about to watch the exact moment the final lock clicks into place. Dmitri paces the hardwood floor with a heavy, predatory grace, openly flaunting his awareness of his own corrupted soul. When Ruby quietly asks if she's one of his mistakes, the air in the room turns dangerously thin. He instantly turns the weapon back on her, demanding to know why she has not already run for her life. She tries to deflect, whispering that he would never let her leave anyway. But he shatters that illusion immediately. He tells her she is only here because she craves the destructive thrill. The most agonizing lesson you will ever learn is that your own hidden darkness will always be used against you. He forces her to realize her own restless boredom built this trap. The most devastating revelation for Ruby is not the criminal ink on his back, nor the endless void in his stare. It is the sickening realization that he is absolutely right. Deep down, a broken part of her thrives on being cornered by danger. She attempts to mask her panic with a hollow laugh, joking about the standard rules of a normal first date. Dmitri remains completely stone-faced, smoothly replying that they are simply accelerating the inevitable. The scene shifts into a modern kitchen, where this ruthless kingpin suddenly starts playing house, casually cooking breakfast, and sharing quiet memories of his mother. The lesson here is written in blood. A monster who cooks you a warm breakfast is still a monster. That illusion of domestic safety just ensures the coming violence will completely destroy you. So there he stands, bathed in morning sunlight, casually unspooling stories about a strict mother and the heavy burdens of his past. He paints a tragically beautiful picture of a simple suburban life, whispering with a heavy sigh that he is forever banished from that kind of peace. It is a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. He reveals just enough bleeding trauma to awaken her desperate need to heal him. We stumble into this exact trap, time and time again, fatally confusing a damaged person's sob story with genuine safety. She watches him move around the kitchen, utterly blind to the steel teeth of the trap closing around her life. He blames a cursed bloodline for the rot in his soul. In the blink of an eye, the terrifying apex predator vanishes, leaving behind a broken boy she feels entirely destined to rescue. Picture the room thick with unspoken truths. He sits across the table, handing her a fabricated illusion of freedom. He promises to spill every bloodstained detail, swearing she can walk out the door right after. Lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper, he unravels the brutal reality of his family's grip on the underworld. You and I have to see what is happening here. This is no noble confession. He is stress testing the heavy psychological chains he just locked around her mind. Sometimes in life, the most dangerous people will show you exactly how terrifying they are, just to see if you are broken enough to stay. He feeds her the cruelty, thriving on the raw shock widening her eyes. He is intoxicated by his own darkness, silently daring her to remain. You can practically hear Ruby's heart hammering as she stares at his obscene wealth, her eyes tracing the violent ink across his skin. She calls him a criminal, her voice trembling, but does the man even flinch? Not for a second. He offers a cold smirk, dismissing the blood on his hands as the rough methods of a businessman. Look at his sheer arrogance. He spins a tragic tale about inheriting a dark throne just to keep the streets from burning. It is a bitter life lesson we all learn eventually. A massive lie always goes down so much easier when it is wrapped in a tragic excuse. Ruby falls right into the trap, seeing a wounded king instead of the apex predator he truly is. He never asks for permission to be a monster. He simply demands that she accept his twisted reality. Every survival instinct Ruby has is screaming at her into the night, but she does not move. The emotional poison is already working through her veins. She sits there, weighing the terrifying reality of his violent empire against the intoxicating heat of his attention. She asks why a man like him would risk everything to tell her the truth. He drops his voice to a bone-deep rumble, confessing that kissing her brought a single spark of light into his pitch-black world. He actually dares to use the word hope. We all need to remember this harsh life lesson. No trap in this world snaps shut harder than the dangerous belief that you alone can save a broken soul. In one breath, he casually drops the crushing weight of his entire salvation right onto her fragile shoulders. The mood shifts so fast it leaves you breathless. His voice cracks just a fraction, and Ruby melts into this fleeting shadow of vulnerability. But suddenly, the sharp sizzle and acrid smell of burning eggs shatters the heavy spell. The untouchable Mafia boss mutters a harsh curse in Russian, entirely defeated by a cheap frying pan, and Ruby laughs. It is not a sweet giggle. It is a ragged, breathless release of absolute panic and total exhaustion. When he turns his cold glare on her, she just points weakly at the rising smoke. The simple life lesson here is one we all know deep down. Humor is our ultimate defense mechanism. We laugh at the terrifying, uncontrollable things in our lives, simply because the only other option is to fall to our knees and scream in pure terror. The steel trap finally closes, and it feels just like slipping into soft silk. Ruby steps into the cramped kitchen, surrendering to this bizarre domestic fantasy. She reaches for the bread, giving up her freedom with a heartbreaking willingness. Dmitri watches her with dark, bottomless eyes. He tells her quietly that she is not running away, and heaven help her. She actually nods. He steps close, dropping his heavy hand onto her shoulder in a cold, possessive brand of ownership. Then he whispers that his enemies will now see her as a target. The life lesson here is brutally harsh but undeniable. When the monster warns you about the big bad wolves outside, he is really just making sure you stay terrified enough to remain safely locked away inside his own personal den. The true tragedy takes root when the tension completely leaves her face. Ruby stands toe-to-toe with a ruthless mob boss, silencing her own screaming intuition. She whispers that she knows there are no fairy tales in his brutal world. You and I can clearly see the painful truth. She is confusing her reckless self-destruction with grand romantic courage. She offers him a fragile smile, handing this killer the keys to her soul. Dmitri pulls her against his chest, muttering that she is either incredibly brave or completely stupid. It is a devastating manipulation. Here is a sobering life lesson to take with you. We constantly dress up our absolute worst mistakes as beautiful destiny, simply to make the inevitable crash feel a little bit better when we finally hit the ground. Look at how fast the walls of her world close in. It happens in a heartbeat. Dmitri casually takes her weekend, and the heavy doors of his velvet-lined underworld swing shut. She is completely severed from her normal life, and the tragedy is that Ruby is starving for it. She trades her quiet apartment for the intoxicating rush of sitting beside an apex predator. The seduction is flawless. Heavily armed men stare at the floor when he passes, yet he pulls out her chair like a perfect gentleman. Listen to me tonight, because this is a vital life lesson. The most dangerous cages are never welded from rusty iron bars. They are built entirely from the blinding, golden illusion that you, out of everyone else, are the chosen one. Sitting together in that dim light, they start trading their darkest traumas like poker chips across a table. Dmitri drops his voice, spinning a brutal story of his harsh childhood. He paints his Mafia empire as a tragic burden he was forced to shoulder. It is a chillingly calculated performance, and Ruby, desperate for connection after a lonely life in foster care, hands him the exact code to break her. She admits she just wants a real home. In that quiet breath, the trap snaps shut. By Sunday night, he is looking at her like a goddess, swearing she is the only soul who truly gets him. Just 48 hours. The lesson here is bitter. Bonding over shattered pieces of trauma does not build a safe fortress. It only builds a shared prison cell, locking you away from reality. See her, shaking fingers tracing the sprawling mob tattoos across his chest. Dmitri gently catches her hand, kisses her palm, and spins an intoxicating fairy tale about fate pulling her into his life. Then he drops the ultimate bomb. He whispers into the quiet dark that he is falling in love with her. 2 days, that is all it took. It is a hostile takeover of her fragile mind, timed to drown out every screaming red flag. Instead of running, Ruby melts into the emotional high, confusing a textbook psychological kidnapping for grand romance. Pay close attention, because we all need this life lesson. When an instant, massive spark feels like a miracle sent to save your life, you are usually just standing dead center in a burning trap. The real tragedy is she actually speaks the truth out loud. Ruby lists every terrifying reason why she needs to run far away from this Mafia boss. Her voice is shaking and completely raw, but in the same breath, she admits she is falling for him anyway. Dmitri just gives that slow, knowing smirk and leans in for a soft kiss to seal her fate. By Monday morning, the contrast breaks your heart. The harsh office lights beat down on her as she sits there, wearing his oversized shirt, sipping the expensive coffee he bought her. It is a quiet, brutal stamp of ownership. We have to remember this hard life lesson. Getting psychologically trapped is rarely a screaming fight in the dark. Usually you walk right back into the broad daylight, fiercely defending your own invisible chains. Back in the dull reality of her office, you can see how far gone she really is. Her best friend Chloe steps up, demanding to know where she vanished to for 3 whole days. Cornered by someone thinking straight, Ruby physically backs away. She tries to brush off a weekend with a crime boss as a silly mistake. She claims she just kissed the wrong guy, forcing a hollow, fake laugh. Chloe just stares back, eyes wide with a creeping sense of horror. She can see the absolute void behind Ruby's eyes, the absence of the girl she knew. It is the chilling truth of the downward spiral. The life lesson here is a bitter pill to swallow. Losing your mind to a toxic situation almost never feels like falling at first. To the person diving into the dark, it feels like they are finally flying. Let's pause and unpack this tragedy together. Think about who Ruby was before this man walked into her life. She was the smart girl, the one who read the fine print and never sat with her back to the door. Now, she is building a massive wall of lies to shut out her oldest friend. Why? Because the manipulation has taken root. She spent the weekend with a violent mobster, but her mind only replays how soft his voice was in the dark. He hooked her on the heavy drug of feeling totally understood. When Chloe pushes for the truth, Ruby dodges with empty corporate talk to kill the conversation. The life lesson for our own world is crystal clear. The exact second you start hiding your reality from the friends who keep you grounded, you are already completely lost in the dark. The vibration of her phone cuts through the stale office air. It is a message from Dmitri. Missing you already. Dinner tonight. He sets this relentless pace deliberately, ensuring her logical mind gets zero time to recover. The real tragedy is that Ruby actually smiles. It is so out of character that Chloe snatches the phone away. Ruby just sits there, her glassy eyes staring right past her friend into some dangerous daydream. She types back that she will be there, her brilliant mind dismantled by a man who lives in the shadows. Listen closely, because here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. We all harbor a deep craving to be wanted, but we forget that dangerous people can easily manufacture the illusion of true love just to keep us locked in their grip. When Ruby asks where to meet, Dmitri does not hesitate. My place, he tells her. I am making dinner. It sounds sweet, right? But make no mistake, this is a calculated strike to pull her off neutral ground and lock her inside his controlled world. They trade playful banter about ruined toast, settling on 7 o'clock. Later, in a crowded cafe, Chloe launches a desperate interrogation. Ruby feeds her friend a completely sanitized story, claiming it was just a random meeting with instant sparks. When Chloe pushes for the catch, Ruby just stares at her hands and calls the man complicated. Here is a truth to carry with you. When someone calls a brand new romance complicated, they are desperately burying massive red flags they are simply too terrified to face. Chloe refuses to drop it, leaning hard across the table. Ruby stares at her untouched food, sketching a sympathetic picture of a guy weighed down by heavy burdens, yeah. Chloe rolls her eyes, assuming he is just another exhausted finance worker. Then Ruby drops her voice to a fragile whisper. She describes his towering frame, his dark hair, and those freezing grey eyes. She admits he looks like he stepped right out of a violent underworld movie. He has the kind of face that makes you want to sprint away and lean in closer all at once. The danger itself is her new addiction. This brings up a tough, simple life lesson about human nature. The people who lock their own hearts behind the thickest steel doors are almost always the easiest targets for a true predator to shatter. Chloe watches Ruby closely, picking up on a terrifying shift. For years, Ruby was the absolute ice queen, tossing guys aside with total emotional detachment. Now, she stares at her screen with blind infatuation. Dmitri fires over a photo of his wrecked kitchen, joking about his terrible cooking. Ruby types back, and an unguarded smile breaks across her face. Chloe calls this change unsettling, but Ruby whispers that she is finally happy. Stick with me here. because you and I are watching the trap spring shut. He is using fake vulnerability to bypass her logic. It is a hard, simple life lesson we all need to learn. We constantly mistake a curated moment of charm for a good soul, forgetting that a ruthless predator can still laugh and ruin a piece of toast. Chloe leans across the table, her voice shaking with dread, begging her friend to wake up. That heavy warning hangs over Ruby all day. Deep down, she knows Dimitri is a violent shadow, wrapped in absolute chaos. But those twisted roots are already burying deep into her brain. She craves the addictive high of his dark attention more than she cares about her own safety. She walks right into his luxury penthouse anyway. The air inside is thick with the smell of scorched garlic and impending doom. Dimitri stands at the door, gently pressing a single finger to her lips in a quiet, devastating scene. Here is the greatest simple life lesson we face. When you ignore the screaming alarms in your head just because someone makes you feel special, you are locking your own cage from the very inside. Dimitri stands in the total wreckage of his kitchen. His hair is a mess, his expensive shirt stained with sauce. To anyone else, he looks like a regular guy defeated by a simple recipe. But this is the calculated theater of a mastermind. By playing the harmless fool, he completely shatters her remaining defenses. The scattered pots and ruined dinner are just a carefully arranged stage play. He flashes Ruby a sheepish grin, claiming he mistranslated the Russian recipe, confusing a gentle simmer with an aggressive boil. It is a quiet flex of his violent roots, all while silently demanding her pity. The simple life lesson here is sharp. Manipulators will gladly play the helpless victim to control the narrative, using an engineered weakness to perfectly trap a willing heart. Watch Ruby's body language as she processes his frustration. She steps into his space, wrapping her arms around his massive shoulders. In psychology, this mimics the terrifying early stages of a hostage bond. She actually sees his failure to cook as a deeply endearing act. Dimitri chuckles, pointing out the dark irony of a crime lord valuing an honest mistake. It is a brilliant deflection, designed to normalize the blood on his hands. They collapse onto the floor, eating takeout among the ruins of his experiment. Ruby truly believes they are sharing a rare, beautiful connection. Always remember this simple life lesson. Genuine intimacy can only grow in the soil of absolute safety. It can never survive in a temporary pause from a predator's violent reality. Dimitri points a scarred finger at the wrecked stove, joking that he discovered a new chemical element. Ruby throws her head back, laughing until her ribs ache. But I need you to pause and look closely at his eyes. He gives her this heavy, manufactured look of wonder. He whispers that 1 week ago, he was stuck in the freezing dark, and now he is terrified she is just a passing ghost. It sounds like peak romance, but this is textbook love bombing. He casts Ruby as the single light in his dark world, dropping the massive weight of his survival straight onto her shoulders. Keep this simple life lesson close to your heart. When someone makes you their only reason for breathing, that is not true romance. They are just quietly turning you into their psychological hostage. Caught in his words, Ruby whispers she never wants to wake up. Stick with me, because you and I need to unpack this setup together. Right at her peak of surrender, Dimitri drops a massive bomb. His Mafia boss mother wants to meet her. He frames this invitation as a deadly threat he must heroically protect her from. He offers to lie to the matriarch, giving Ruby a totally fake way out. Watching this manipulation play out is wild. By pointing to an exit door he knows she will never use, he manipulates her into walking into the fire on her own. It ties her to him through the illusion of free will. Here is your simple life lesson. The hardest cages to escape are the ones we build ourselves. When we mistake a toxic trap for our own choice, we hand over our freedom with a smile. Ruby gasps as the insane stakes hit her. Meeting Elena is no standard dinner date. It is a brutal psychological audit run by the boss of a criminal empire. Dmitri leans close, warning her that his mother reads people like open books. Then, he slides the ultimate hook into place. He whispers that his mother will finally see a woman worth protecting, even from himself. This twisted paradox is the heartbeat of a trauma bond. The villain paints himself as the only shield against his own monstrous nature. Ruby agreeing to this is not a brave romantic move. It shows how deep the brainwashing goes. The simple life lesson here is chilling. We can get so desperate for affection that we mistake the cold walls of a prison cell for a safe fortress. By the time we notice, the iron doors are locked. Dmitri touches her cheek, asking if she is sure about this. Ruby is trembling. She admits she is terrified, but she nods anyway. Watch this moment closely, because it is an absolute tragedy. She is burying her survival instincts just to keep this mobster happy. He whispers that he picked her because her soul mirrors his own. To a lonely girl starving for connection, that sounds like pure salvation. In reality, it is just a predator securing his meal ticket. He feeds her the exact lines she craves, so she walks right into the slaughterhouse. The simple life lesson to take away here is terrifying. The most dangerous people in this world do not drag you away kicking and screaming. They just make you feel so deeply understood that you gladly burn your own bridges to safety. They stay tangled up on the floor, acting like tomorrow is never coming. But morning always wrecks the fantasy. Now, we step into the Brooklyn brownstone to face the final boss, Elena. The second they walk in, Elena dissects Ruby with one cold look. She is a terrifying mix of elegant silver hair and pure Mafia authority. Without missing a beat, Elena casually mentions how Ruby once kissed Dmitri while thinking he was another guy. That is a lethal, calculated sniper shot right to the heart. By weaponizing an embarrassing secret from her past, Elena instantly shatters her armor. The simple life lesson here is that true power never has to shout. The quickest way to destroy someone is to calmly prove you already know their worst mistakes before the game even begins. Dmitri tries a weak warning, but his mother Elena swats him away like a gnat. She smirks, praising Ruby's wild energy, and pulls her deeper into the estate. The house smells of roasting garlic and wood smoke. But this warmth is a devastating psychological mind game, masking the blood of their Mafia empire. When Ruby mumbles that she expected a colder place, Elena smiles, insisting the violence stays outside. Then the steel trap snaps. Elena casually orders her son out of the room. By banishing Dmitri, she instantly severs Ruby's only emotional lifeline in this den of wolves. It is a quiet, brutal execution of her defenses. Always remember this simple life lesson. The exact second somebody subtly separates you from your backup, the real interrogation has already begun. The second those heavy doors click shut, Ruby is totally boxed in. Listen to me on this one. Elena does not even try to deny the crazy, violent rumors about her son. Nope, she leans across the table, drops her voice to an ice-cold whisper, and straight up weaponizes them. We are watching a boss-level psychological stress test go down right here. She casually recites Ruby's miserable foster care history, ripping through her childhood trauma to prove she has eyes everywhere. She is figuring out the exact amount of pressure needed to snap her in half. Let that be a massive wake-up call for you. A true mastermind does not comfort your hidden pain. They just take notes, wait for the perfect moment, and turn your absolute worst nightmares into their greatest weapon against you. Elena is surgically dismantling Ruby's quiet little life, peeling back the layers of her soul. She twists the girl's innocent love for old books, framing it as a paper-thin shield hiding a massive fear of abandonment. Ruby's hands tremble against the mahogany table, but she lifts her chin like a defiant queen. She whispers that she stays with this violent mobster because he actually sees her. She genuinely believes Dmitri would burn the entire world down to ash just to keep her safe. It is a devastating portrait of total surrender. Her absolute terror of being left behind has completely deleted her basic survival instincts, trading a safe reality for the ghost of a promise. It shows us a heartbreaking truth about life. When you have starved for security your entire existence, a dangerous man's toxic obsession can look exactly like true love. Elena leans back, a completely cold smile creeping across her painted lips as she tests the final layer of this twisted conditioning. When Ruby confesses that her own obsession terrifies her, the older woman nods with dark approval. She whispers that safe love is meant for boring people, beautifully romanticizing a life built on pure chaos. Then she drops the heavy, bloody history of her dead husband, revealing the crushing, agonizing guilt Dmitri carries over his tragic father. It feels like a quiet, vulnerable moment of bonding, but it is actually a lethal bear trap. By handing over the map to her son's deepest trauma, Elena drafts the young girl right into their Mafia war as a human shield. Always be careful around people who bond quickly through shared trauma. They usually just want someone else to bleed for them. You and I can almost feel the air freeze as this insane trap finally springs shut. Elena's voice pours out like velvet over broken glass, telling Ruby that surviving her son's chaotic orbit means she is either profoundly special or undeniably dangerous. It is a tragic trick, making the young woman feel like a queen among wolves. Right on cue, Dmitri steps out of the shadows to play the reluctant savior. Elena laughs and swirls her iced vodka, masking a literal death threat with a casual family joke. The lethal tension suddenly melts into this sick, cozy domestic vibe. This dizzying swing between mortal danger and warm laughter totally shatters a person's inner compass, forcing blind trust. The hardest lesson we ever learn is that the most comforting fires are often the ones deliberately built to burn us alive. Enter Mila, slipping into the frame right beneath the soft glow of the crystal chandelier. The sister plays her part flawlessly, acting as this harmless, bubbly distraction. She gossips about paperback novels, rolling her eyes at her brother's blood-soaked crime empire as if he merely worked late at some boring office job. She casually dismisses Dimitri's brutal nature as just the ache of a lonely soul, claiming Ruby alone has cured his dark moods. It is a beautifully orchestrated trap unfolding in real time. By turning a lethal killer's isolation into an endearing flaw, the family feeds directly into Ruby's tragic savior complex. They literally hand her the leash to the monster, making her feel completely in control. The sad truth of life is that our desperate need to fix broken people is usually the exact thing that breaks us. The psychological conditioning settles deep into the bone. Mila gently rests her warm hand over Ruby's, begging her not to fear Dimitri's frozen exterior. She whispers a sweet, absurd story about the ruthless killer crying during a children's movie. It paints a humanizing picture, planting the false belief in Ruby's heart that a tender, wounded boy lives beneath the monster. Elena holds her gaze across the table, her voice dropping to a serious, chilling tone. She tells the girl she belongs here, whether she knows it yet or not. This is no warm family embrace. It is a literal life sentence handed down over tea. The cruelest lesson of all is that the most inescapable prisons are always the ones we lock ourselves inside with a willing, grateful smile. For one fleeting night, Ruby allowed her exhausted mind to feel the warmth of true belonging. But friction always follows a lowered shield. Morning brings a jarring text message. Julian has breached the perimeter and is pacing her office lobby. Instantly, Ruby's breathing turns incredibly shallow, a visceral trauma response seizing her chest. To her, Julian ceased to exist the exact second she kissed Dimitri. But Julian is bleeding from a shattered ego, his fragile pride screaming out for validation. Feeling totally ignored, he abandons all dignity, causing a volatile public scene just to force her attention. Life reminds us here, quite violently, that turning a blind eye to a problem never makes it magically disappear. Unspoken obsessions only fester quietly in the dark until they are ready to tear the doors off entirely. As Ruby steps into the cold light of the lobby, she presses her fingers to her temples to numb the headache of her dual lives colliding. Julian stands waiting. On paper, this guy is the perfect catch. He wears a sharp suit, projecting the manicured stability of a television commercial. Yet today, his eyes are wild. He paces the tile like a starving animal, radiating the furious heat of a bruised narcissist. He blocks her path, demanding to know where she vanished to, deeply humiliated to learn the truth from a friend. Instead of offering grace, Ruby meets his frantic energy with eyes as cold as winter. She flatly tells him she simply had other plans. It teaches us a very cold truth about human nature. Genuine indifference will always be a far sharper, more devastating blade than anger ever could be. Julian refuses to retreat, narrowing his eyes to claw back his lost dominance. He demands a name, choking on the primitive, ugly instinct to know who took what he firmly believes is rightfully his. Ruby tries to sidestep him, but Julian closes the distance, suffocating her with his looming frame and sharp cologne. He starts tallying his romantic efforts like a bitter merchant, listing the rare book he bought, the custom suit, the exclusive dinner table. To him, romance is just a coin you insert into a machine, entitling him to her total affection. Julian arrived early due to a friend's plotting, while Ruby was delayed. We must always remember a simple, grounding truth. Treating human affection like a calculated business transaction guarantees you will eventually end up entirely morally bankrupt. Let's pause and look at the tragic ballet of Ruby's rationalization. She first tries to de-escalate the clash by blaming their crossed timelines, a nervous reflex to appease his rising temper. But then, a dark shadow crosses her face, and she brutally retracts her offer to reschedule. She is fully tethered to the Mafia boss now. Julian's jaw clicks shut, displaying the physical tremor of a shattered ego. He sneers, ripping into her timeline, refusing to believe a real, lasting bond could be forged in a single week. To him, this is just a frantic rebound from a failed social contract. Yet Ruby stands there wrapped tightly in her delusion, entirely deaf to his logic. It is a haunting reminder of human frailty. A heart desperate for salvation will fiercely defend the exact illusion that is actively destroying it. Julian bitterly lists the research he compiled on her, waving his effort around like a crumpled receipt of his romantic worth. He treats human connection like a cold accounting ledger, and today he feels violently robbed. He demands the other man's name, desperately needing a target for his humiliation. A healthy instinct would scream at Ruby to walk away. Instead, intoxicated by twisted defiance, she holds his gaze and drops the name, Dmitry Volkov. The shift is absolute. The angry color instantly drains from Julian's cheeks, replaced by the pale sweat of pure terror. He physically out from where her. Ruby merely frowns, utterly blind to the lethal magnitude of her confession. Life repeatedly proves that stubborn arrogance, mixed with willful ignorance, is the most dangerous poison a person can ever consume. All the arrogant bluster drains completely from Julian's spine. His voice plunges into a terrified whisper. He leans in, trying to crack her delusion, asking if she truly grasps the scale of the apex predator she is entertaining. When Ruby silently nods, Julian barks a hollow, broken laugh. He paints the grim reality. The Volkov name is soaked in blood, rooted in a violent pathology that swallows normal people whole. We are witnessing the tragic moment where a mind willingly decorates its own slaughterhouse, mistaking a butcher's knife for a protective shield. Ruby digs her heels in, flashing the eerie calm of early Stockholm Syndrome. Julian's bruised ego evaporates into genuine pity. He begs her to run, teaching us an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, our most abrasive critics are the only ones actually trying to save our lives. Listen close to the static on the dial tonight. Julian stands there, a hollow shell, watching a brilliant woman's logic completely unravel. Ruby is caught in the toxic glare of a deep trauma bond. She looks at Dmitry's capacity for extreme violence and somehow sees a twisted, protective love. It shatters Julian's sanitized masculinity. With hollow eyes, he delivers a chilling final verdict. Monsters never give their captives happy endings. He walks away, leaving her shaking in the cold. But the devil always has perfect timing. Her phone buzzes. Dmitry is casually asking her to lunch. Here is a quiet truth to remember. The darkest cages in this world are never built with heavy iron bars. They are woven from sweet whispered invitations. Let us sift through the ashes of this broken movement together. Dmitry sets up a quiet meeting to settle her nerves, and Ruby, vibrating between pure panic and a deeply shattered attachment, warns him she is dragging heavy secrets. He just pours her a drink, the oldest trick in the book to lower your defenses. Fast forward to the cold shadows of his penthouse, and she completely breaks. She throws away every single warning Julian gave her, basically signing her life over in blood. Dmitry just sits there in terrifying, absolute stillness. Then he leans close and calmly whispers that Julian was entirely right to be afraid. The lesson here leaves a heavy mark. Sometimes the cruelest trap a toxic person can set is simply telling you the ugly truth and sitting back as you walk straight into the flames. Dmitry operates with the cold precision of a surgeon, breaking down the twisted roots of his own life. He openly admits that staying near him guarantees her absolute ruin. Here we witness the most dangerous shadow in the room, the fully self-aware narcissist. He confesses the war between his logic and his primal urge to consume her, whispering his dark plan to build a fortress that blocks out the sun until he is her only light. When Ruby says this sounds exactly like a hostage situation, the man does not even blink. He just reaches out, his thumb tracing her skin, sealing that poison with a soft touch. It teaches us an agonizing truth. The tightest chains in life are never heavy iron. They are made of a gentle, familiar touch we are simply too terrified to ever pull away from. Picture this scene playing out in the heavy midnight silence. We zoom in on his hands as he weaves a dangerously hypnotic spell. He is not promising Ruby a quiet future or a safe tomorrow. He only offers the chaotic, burning intensity of right now. His fingers lock with hers, forging a physical chain in the fires of her own trauma. You can literally watch her survival instincts pack up and abandon her. She stares into his predatory eyes, trading her actual safety for the desperate illusion of being seen. Exactly 14 days later, the bill for this dark bargain arrives inside a sketchy manila envelope. It brings a harsh reality we all stumble over eventually, sometimes. The choices that feel like a desperate, saving lifeline are the exact same choices that guarantee our total destruction. The dream abruptly shatters under harsh, buzzing office lights. Ruby sits at her desk, sweating cold drops, while desperately pretending everything is fine. But the past never stops hunting you. Her clueless friend Chloe walks up and drops an unmarked envelope right in front of her. Just seeing the blank cover sends pure ice flooding through Ruby's veins. Chloe gives her a strange look, catching sight of the trembling hands Ruby has tried to hide all week. The second she is alone, Ruby tears the paper open, and her worst nightmare spills out. High-resolution stalker photographs. Ruby and Dmitri eating, walking, whispering in his dark car. Someone has tracked her every move. It proves a wildly tragic point. No matter how deep you bury the past, your secrets will always leave a heavy trail for the dark to follow. A typed note slips out, dripping with sick threats to completely destroy her life. Her hands are violently shaking now. Her brain races, quickly ruling out her bitter ex, Julian. His petty drama is far too sloppy for this kind of chilling precision. No, this mess belongs entirely to Dmitri and his shadowy underworld. Driven by the absolute sickness of her trauma bond, she runs him straight back to the man who painted the target on her back. She throws the photos across his desk, but Dmitri barely blinks. He spreads them out slowly, like a cold mortician, masking the homicidal rage boiling just beneath his skin. It is a tragic reality we often learn the hard way. The fierce protectors we blindly run toward are usually far more dangerous than the unseen monsters we are trying to escape. The air in the room drops below freezing as Dmitri begins a brutal interrogation. He demands exact times and impossible details. Ruby cries out that the delivery guy was just a shadow, a faceless ghost meant to be forgotten. She wraps her arms around herself, fighting a total breakdown, begging to understand why this is happening. Dimitri's voice turns to absolute ice. He starts naming the real monsters in the dark, ancient blood feuds, and ruthless rivals. She is no longer just his lover. She is a glowing weak point in his heavy armor. When she sobs, apologizing just for breathing, he yanks her wrist hard. Listen closely to this. Love built on total domination is an absolute lie. It is nothing but a beautifully decorated, incredibly expensive cage designed to lock your soul away from the real world forever. A tiny flicker of guilt flashes in his eyes, but it vanishes, swallowed by a vow to hunt these stalkers down. Anyone else would sprint for the hills hearing a promise of pure slaughter. Instead, their toxic bond twists his dark violence into a blanket of safety. She absolutely refuses to run. Stepping up to him, she gently cups the face of a ruthless crime boss, anchoring her fate to his shadows. Something inside him shatters at her touch. He yanks her into a crushing hug, whispering a promise to burn the planet to ash before letting anyone take her. It highlights a deeply flawed human truth. We constantly stare into a raging fire that will completely destroy us, and convince ourselves it is just the desperate warmth we need to survive the freezing night. Now watch how fiercely the dark underworld moves. Barely 48 hours later, Yuri steps into the heavy silence of the study. His face is a stone wall as he delivers the grim news. The stalker is a rat for a rival crew, and they have been watching her for 3 straight weeks. The camera pushes in on Dmitri. His jaw is locked tight, veins visibly pulsing. Turning to Ruby, His voice is unnervingly calm as he explains this twisted chess game. The rival boss is simply poking the bear, testing to see if catching feelings has made the great king vulnerable. It serves as a stark reality check for us all. In this unforgiving world, even the sharpest and deadliest swords will eventually rust if you leave them exposed to the unpredictable, messy beating of the human heart. The illusion of choice has officially vanished. Dimitri flatly orders Ruby to pack her bags and drop completely off the grid. Naturally, her last healthy instinct fights back. She stands her ground, clinging to her normal world, her friends, her job, her apartment. But a man who rules an empire never compromises. Dimitri steps from the shadows and drops a devastating reality check. He bluntly tells her those comforts will mean absolutely nothing when she is zipped up in a cold body bag. By flooding her mind with the sheer panic of death, he shatters her logic and crowns himself as her ultimate savior. We must always remember this lesson. Fear is the fastest way to break a person down, building heavy, isolating walls that we desperately mistake for a safe shelter. Notice the toxic shift in his strategy here. When her fear collides with her last shred of stubbornness, Dimitri drops the hardened boss act and literally starts begging. He pleads with her to let him be her protector, dressing up his obsessive control as a bleeding devotion. He commands her to sever ties with her best friend, urging her to fake a family tragedy and ghost everyone she knows. He whispers that the thought of losing her is tearing his mind apart. This is the final plunge into total isolation. Ruby, blinded by her craving to be loved, looks at this massive red flag and sees a romantic fairy tale. The truth is terrifying. The most inescapable traps in life are rarely made of cold steel. They are woven from the desperate, crying pleas of the people we think we love. Yuri drives her into the suffocating night, guarding her like stolen gold. When the steel door of his luxury brownstone seals shut, the echo sounds exactly like a vault locking forever. This fortress of bulletproof glass is severed from the world, but as she paces those pristine floors, you and I see the terrifying depth of her conditioning. Her hands tremble, yet she sheds no tears for her stolen freedom. Her heart agonizes only over Dimitri's safety. She has taken the cold iron bars of her cage and painted them a blinding gold. Listen closely, but because it forces us to confront a heavy truth, the most impossible prisons to escape are never the physical rooms that hold us, but the beautiful, tragic lies we construct in our minds just to survive an unbearable reality. Inside this velvet purgatory, guards stand like breathless statues. Elena, the boss's mother, drifts into the room, studying Ruby with eyes carrying decades of heavy exhaustion. She asks if the girl would have chosen this path, knowing the agonizing price. Ruby instantly raises her emotional shields. Infected by this toxic romance, she fires back, vowing never to abandon him just because the water is turning red. She is desperately dressing up her hostage situation as a poetic tragedy. Elena merely watches, seeing the tragic ghost of her own ruined youth staring back from those defiant eyes. It lays bare a brutal reality. History never just repeats itself quietly. It violently demands a front row seat, perfectly willing to use our fragile lives to replay its oldest tragedies. This is where the roots of toxicity take hold, as a broken generation teaches the young to swallow the bloodshed. Ruby begs to find reason in this nightmare, yet Elena calmly pours tea, slipping into the role of a twisted mentor. She shares the violent history of her mob marriage, painting relentless gunfire and midnight terror as an epic romance. She is instructing this girl how to normalize the suffocating panic in her chest. Elena commands Ruby to trust no one beyond these steel doors, insisting that isolation is the purest devotion. Paranoia is seamlessly rebranded as ride-or-die loyalty. It leaves us holding a chilling life lesson. A shared delusion between two completely broken souls is often the most unbreakable bond you will ever encounter. The lens lingers on the defeated slump of Elena's shoulders. Surviving decades on the razor's edge brings a soul-crushing exhaustion. She admits her weariness, yet instinctively bandages her deep wounds with romantic grandiosity. She describes eating a quiet dinner as a defiant victory against a hateful universe. It is a terrifying psychological trick, magnifying basic survival to justify endless mafia horror. She survived her husband's bloody downfall through pure bitter spite. But before the gravity of this confession can crush Ruby, a piercing security alarm shatters the dead air. Crimson lights pulse violently across their pale faces. We have to remember this unyielding life lesson. True peace is merely a brief, cruel illusion for anyone who actively chooses to live by the sword. Picture the dim, flickering hallway lights as the crisis breaks. The threat is neutralized, but when the boss stumbles inside, he is utterly ruined. His suit hangs heavy, suffocating the room with the dark scent of absolute violence. For Ruby, the biological response is instant. A flood of dopamine completely washes away her terror. Elena murmurs a cold reminder that chronic paranoia is now her permanent shadow. Yet our girl is blind to it, focusing only on his sheer exhaustion. She refuses to see the ruthless mafia monster standing in her home. Instead, she sees a tragically beautiful god who just bled exclusively for her. It highlights a red flag we must all recognize. Listen to this life lesson. The most fatal mistake you can ever make is confusing a predator's physical fatigue for genuine emotional vulnerability. Watch the exact frame where her moral boundaries dissolve into ash. He leans in, casually whispering that he used persuasion instead of lethal force. He literally promises there are no bodies. That insane admission should make anyone sprint for the exit, but her ethical compass is shattered. The camera pushes in as she reaches out, her trembling fingers tracing the bruises on his jawline. She whispers that she never cared about those other men. Her entire moral universe has violently shrunk down to the heavy rhythm of his chest. It is a terrifying reality check for anyone listening tonight. Here is the unvarnished life lesson. When you prioritize a monster's comfort over the brutal reality of his crimes, you stop being a victim and morph into his silent, complicit partner. Notice how the emotional climax of this trauma cycle relies entirely on physical exhaustion. They collapse onto that velvet mattress, fully clothed, breathing heavily. Their ruined nervous systems are crashing after days of suffocating panic. She presses her tear-stained face into his chest, confessing how she agonized over his safety. The megalomaniac offers a performative apology, but she swats it away, demanding only that he stay close. In a terrifying twist of fractured logic, she utterly dismisses his lethal nature. She weakly laughs, comparing his capacity for mass violence to some harmless inability to cook dinner. It teaches us a grim, undeniable life lesson. The deepest psychological sickness always hides right behind the comforting, familiar mask of quiet domestic intimacy. 3 months bleed away, and the camera pans across the cold glass of their fortified penthouse. We have officially entered the chronic phase of her condition. She stares out at the city, interpreting her constant baseline of terror as an elevated, poetic state of living. She twists her mother's warnings, convincing herself that feeling every emotion at maximum volume is the only true way to exist. This is the devastation of pure adrenal addiction. Her ordinary job is now just a hollow ghost acting through her numb fingers. Her only true reality is this luxurious, high-altitude cage wrapped in steel. It forces us to digest a harsh life lesson. Once you become deeply addicted to the violent storm of toxic drama, a normal, peaceful life will only ever feel like you are slowly suffocating. To survive this madness, she anchors herself to mundane rituals. Watch her grip her morning coffee mug like a lifeline, pulling her from the deep. She stages petty arguments over breakfast to frame her bizarre Mafia captivity as a normal romance. But the real world always bleeds through. Enter her coworker, Chloe, acting as the ultimate reality check. Chloe squints, noticing her friend's hollow eyes and detachment, playfully calling the hidden partner her mystery man. Instantly, Ruby's throat tightens. She frantically builds a psychological wall to protect the violent ecosystem she now calls home. It reminds us of an unbending rule of human nature and a vital life lesson. The harder you try to hide a pitch-black truth, the heavier it becomes to carry on your shoulders every single day. Observe the paralyzing panic she feels over a simple dinner invitation. She is frantically compartmentalizing, her hands trembling as she imagines her bright world colliding with the blood-stained reality of her toxic life. She knows Chloe is sharp. One look, and Chloe will instantly spot the violent undercurrents dragging her friend down. Cornered by peer pressure, she caves and agrees to the dinner. When Chloe playfully asks if this secret boyfriend is simply weird, Ruby defensively snaps back, quickly rebranding his terrifying aura as just being intensely private. It exposes a haunting psychological truth and a crucial life lesson. We will always reshape the absolute ugliest facts into harmless little quirks long before we are ever willing to admit we are sleeping next to a literal monster. Stick with me here, because this text exchange captures the absolute absurdity of their lives. She types furiously, literally begging this ruthless mafia kingpin to play a harmless civilian for 2 hours. She explicitly forbids his looming bodyguards and his natural urge to intimidate. He reads the screen, a dark smirk pulling at his lips. He knows that stripping away his dominance leaves nothing of his true self behind. Yet, he agrees to wear the mask. Across town, she stands before a mirror, frantically tearing through her wardrobe to construct the illusion of a healthy, functioning woman. But no matter the clothes she chooses, the life lesson remains crystal clear. You can never dress a living nightmare up in bright daylight and realistically expect it to pass for a normal, peaceful reality. Pacing the floor, she finally speaks the absurdity out loud. Her voice cracks, realizing she is dragging her innocent friend into the orbit of a dangerous criminal. He reaches out, stroking her hair, flawlessly gaslighting her by claiming his terrifying reputation is just a formal sign of respect. He promises to be charming and blend in. But you and I know that when those restaurant doors swing open, the psychological collision is deafening. Chloe sits at the table, her sharp eyes instantly tracking his dark suit, his predatory gait, and the way waiters instinctively shrink away from his shadow. It proves a simple rule of nature and a powerful life lesson we must remember. A wolf can never truly hide its sharp teeth, no matter how softly it tries to walk among the rest of us. Let us look at this specific moment together, you and I. The tension at that table thickens into heavy concrete the second Dimitri steps into her world. When Chloe leans forward, playfully prodding the mystery man for details, Dimitri deploys the flawless camouflage of an apex predator. He speaks in a soft, measured tone, spinning a boring tale of corporate logistics to kill any suspicion. But Chloe is sharp. Her eyes narrow as a natural immune response flares up against the dangerous man hiding behind that silk tie. She senses the absolute coldness radiating from his core. It teaches us a simple life lesson. Always trust that sudden, unexplainable chill down your spine when someone seems just a little too perfect. The focus shifts to Ruby, her cheeks as flush a deep crimson as she rushes to cover the dead silence, frantically spinning a fictional story of their fateful meeting. She paints it as a charming mistake in a crowded bar, claiming she kissed her blind date. But beneath that crisp white tablecloth out of sight, Dimitri asserts his physical dominance. His heavy hand clamps down hard on her knee. It is a suffocating reminder that she remains his captive. They both knew the fatal error of that first night, yet neither stepped back from the edge. Here lie the deep roots of her psychological trauma. It serves as a tragic life lesson for us all. A desperate, lonely heart will always try to rebrand a predator's calculated trap as an act of beautiful fate. Today, you and I are going to unpack this absolute madness together. Chloe is simply not backing down. Her gut is screaming to rip the mask off this mafia boss. But Dimitri is a master of dark manipulation. With the ice-cold stare of a predator, he reaches across the table, grabs Ruby by the hand, and drops a massive plot twist. He says he loves her. That heavy confession flattens Chloe and her doubts. He leans back, laughing like a normal guy, spinning fake stories about his awful cooking. It is a flawless, terrifying performance. It brings us to a harsh life lesson. Real monsters do not hide in dark alleys waiting to jump you. Most of the time, they are sitting right across from you, smiling warmly while they pour your drinks. The very second this mob boss excuses himself, the heavy tension in the room instantly shatters. Chloe lets out a massive breath, leaning over the table to give her reluctant blessing. She completely mistakes his violently possessive obsession for deep, romantic affection. Chloe still warns her best friend to watch her back, sensing the razor blades under his smooth gentleman act. But that warning is way too late. Ruby is already drowning. She sees the glaring red flags, but she is holding onto the bars of her own cage with a death grip. It leaves us with a heavy life lesson. Sometimes people will fight tooth and nail to stay locked up because the brutal heat of a monster they know feels safer than the cold reality of walking away. Dimitri slides back to the table with the silent energy of a wolf reclaiming his turf. Chloe tries to act tough, throwing out a hollow threat about hurting him if he ever breaks her friend's heart. It is tragic, watching her warn a literal hitman. He just flashes a cold smile, shutting her down completely. Weeks later, they are back at the Crimson Lounge. This mafia mastermind knows exactly what he is doing. He uses the heavy red lights to trigger the memory of when he first trapped her, locking in that intense trauma bond. The life lesson here is incredibly important. The physical places where our boundaries are first broken down will echo in our minds forever, tricking us into thinking that a room full of pure danger is actually a safe place to call home. The focus shifts entirely to the dark bar, catching the exact second the atmosphere flips. Ruby watches Dimitri drop his terrifying mob boss glare. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The bartender slides their drinks over without a single word. All the background noise cuts out as the brutal truth hits her. Dimitri set up this romantic movie scene weeks ago, pulling strings from the shadows like an absolute puppet master. His hands rest perfectly still, completely in charge of the room. This brings us to a dark life lesson about power. For those who demand absolute control, strict dominance is their only version of romance. A deeply broken heart will always look at a perfectly planned, inescapable trap and completely mistake it for true, genuine love. That warm lighting hits right as Dimitri leans in, his jaw physically shaking with the effort of his performance. He drops his voice into an intense, quiet whisper, feeding her a massive line about how shocked he was when she first touched him. He acts like a lost soul in the dark who finally found his single spark of light. He stares dead into her eyes, spinning an insane web of emotional manipulation, swearing he is the only man alive who truly understands her. He's literally building a mental prison around her, brick by brick. Here is the brutal life lesson we all need to remember tonight. Our completely desperate craving to feel seen and understood can easily blind us to the terrible, metallic sound of a heavy padlock snapping shut right behind us. The sharp click of that velvet ring box opening is somehow louder than a gunshot in the quiet room. Dimitri pulls out the ring, and the low light hits this massive diamond, highlighting the nasty, violent scars on his face. He puts on the ultimate performance, playing the broken bad boy who can only be saved by an angel. He claims her pure soul has rewritten his mobster heart. He openly admits he is a monster, swearing he can never give her a safe, normal life, while promising to be her bulletproof shield. The collision of absolute terror and dark romances is overwhelming, but the life lesson hiding here is a bitter pill to swallow. We will eagerly trade our total freedom for a locked cell, just as long as the man holding the keys whispers that we are truly special. Ruby lets out a shaky, broken breath, completely caving in to the crushing gravity of his toxic world. As she slides that cold diamond onto her finger, she is literally tying her soul to the most dangerous man in the city. And here is the sick irony. All the random people eating in the restaurant start clapping. They are cheering for a lost sheep, willingly hugging a hungry, waiting wolf. Ruby has these huge, glossy eyes, fully believing she has finally found her real purpose inside this absolute chaos. It hands us a brutal life lesson, written right there in her tearful smile. When you have spent your entire life freezing in the cold, the quiet safety of a normal life is never going to beat the addictive, dangerous heat of a raging house fire. Stick with me here, because the madness only deepens. We jump forward 6 months to their massive, opulent wedding. Golden sunlight makes this toxic trap look like a romantic masterpiece. Chloe stands off to the side, quietly stressing out, her worry buried under white lace and soft piano music. The aisles are packed with dangerous Mafia hitmen in tailored suits, looking like stone gargoyles guarding a prison. At the altar, Dimitri watches his bride walk down. His mouth twitches with the smug pride of a hunter bagging his ultimate prize. He even offers her a fake, empty chance to back out. This drops a chilling life lesson about our world. We are so deeply obsessed with pretty aesthetics that we will gladly decorate the most terrifying cages with the finest white silk. The officiant finishes speaking, his voice echoing across the silent room. This is the exact moment the transfer of ownership is locked in. Ruby, a girl who grew up completely unstable, has tied her life to a mob boss whose very name makes grown men cry. As the orchestra kicks in, Dimitri yanks her close. He brushes his lips against her ear, whispering dark promises of forever. The way his hand grips her waist is intensely possessive, instantly blocking any chance of escape. We are watching a deeply tragic dance. The life lesson is seriously haunting. People who never had a safe home growing up will gladly build their lives on the edge of a cliff. They easily confuse the crushing weight of a predator with the steady ground they always desperately wanted. A whole year flies by, We find Ruby sitting inside a fancy publishing office. The sun shines through the glass as she stares down at a new book submission. Her eyes dart over the pages, realizing this story perfectly mirrors her own toxic marriage to a mafia monster. A hysterical, unhinged laugh rips out of her throat. It is the raw sound of a total mental breakdown. When Chloe runs into the room, Ruby casually wipes a tear away, claiming Dimitri gave her this manic joy. It is a terrifying display of totally surrendering your own mind. This brings up a rough life lesson about survival mode. Once your brain completely commits to living a massive lie, it will violently rewrite its own memories just to make the madness around you feel like a perfectly normal Tuesday. You and I are going to sit in the quiet and watch this unfold, because this is where the tough guy act shatters into a million jagged pieces. Ruby stands in their massive bedroom, her hands trembling as she drops the absolute heaviest truth. She is pregnant. For the first time ever, the bulletproof facade of this mafia boss completely implodes. Dimitri literally collapses inward. Those broad shoulders shake, and real tears pour down a face mapped with brutal scars. It is a haunting image, watching a terrifying monster realize his violent legacy is becoming an actual breathing child. It leaves us with a simple truth: the most heavily guarded walls are never smashed down by brute force. They are quietly dismantled by the fragile, terrifying weight of bringing a new life into the world. The next months blur into a storm of chaos. This ruthless Don throws the laws of the underworld away, consumed by an agonizing need to protect his child. The finale hits us in the dead silence of a hospital room. Dimitri stands frozen, staring down at his newborn daughter. Her tiny chest rises and falls, living proof of their deeply painful trauma bond. His voice cracks into a rough whisper as he names her Nadia. Hope. You and I can easily feel the irony hanging in that cold room. We are watching a man forged in street violence, desperately reaching for the brightest light imaginable. It teaches us a haunting lesson. Even the most corrupted souls will relentlessly chase the sunrise, begging to hold onto one pure, untainted thing they could never be themselves. Look at this final haunting frame. Dimitri, the boss, who brutally tore through his enemies, locks eyes with Ruby. His gaze is raw and desperate. He confesses that she is the only person who ever took his shattered soul and glued the pieces back together. Ruby breaks. A heavy sob rips from her chest, washing away years of surviving endless betrayals. Beside them, little Nadia opens her eyes for the first time. They are a stormy gray, proving their violent history forged a twisted masterpiece. The raging storm outside finally fades into complete silence. As you and I sit here in the aftermath, a beautiful truth remains. Sometimes your most reckless mistakes are the exact fires you must endure. Those flames burn away your broken cycles, finally guiding you out of the bitter cold and straight into a true home.